Session 5. In this study session, we shall explore the evil, quote-unquote, called imperialism. And we shall do this by examining the various theories that have been advanced by scholars on the subject. And when you have started this session, you should be able to discuss Hobson's view of imperialism and why it is referred to as economic theory of imperialism. 2. You should be able to give the contrasts between Hobson's and Lenin's theory of imperialism. You should also be able to discuss the reasons why Schumpeter's theory of imperialism is considered to be of low utilitarian value. 4. You should be able to discuss why the Devil's and Schumpeter's theory are considered inferior to Hobson's and Lenin's. Now let's move straight to Hobson's theory of imperialism. In 1920, J.A. Hobson wrote a book which he titled Imperialism, a Study. By publishing this book, Hobson started a series of theoretical discussions on the imperialism, and as a serious-minded scholars, they were not satisfied with the explanations presented by imperialist statesmen, their field workers, and intellectual supporters. John Atkinson Hobson was born in 1858 and bred in the middle stratum of the Middle East of a middle-sized industrial town of Middlelands. His theory was not only the first systematic, articulated, and scientifically researched study, it was also the first economic theory of imperialism. Now let's have this hint of Hobson's theory. It says imperialism as a consequence of maladjustments in the capitalist mode of production, which brings in its wake a grossly unfair income distribution pattern, which is among different social classes that make up civil society. This in turn results in underconsumption on one hand and oversavings on the other. Progressively, excess goods pile up within the economy as well as excess capital. It puts these as follows, and I quote, "Everywhere appears excessive powers of production, excessive capital in search of investment. It is admitted by all businessmen that the growth of power and production in the country exceeds the growth in consumption, that more goods can be produced than can be sold at a profit, and the more capitalists exist they can find all remunerative investments. It is this economic condition of affairs that forms the taproot of imperialism." Take note that it is important to pay attention to the above quotation as it explains why Hobson's theory of imperialism is referred to as economic theory of imperialism. His last sentence is particularly worthy of note because it leaves no one in doubt as to what he believes to be the main cause of imperialism, or, in his own words, the taproot of imperialism. Also, much has Hobson traced the taproot of imperialism to a particular economic condition of affairs, he recognized the role which the use of political power plays in implementing an imperialist society. It can even be said that Hobson recognized the limitations of economic actors in achieving their ends. Now let's have another quote from him, and I read, "As one nation after another enters the machine economic and adopts advanced industrial methods, it becomes more difficult for its manufacturers, merchants, and financiers to dispose profitably of their economic resources, and they are tempted more and more to use their governments in order to secure for their particular use some distant underdeveloped country by annexation and protection. Now, taking a look at this quotation, it appears that imperialist enterprise is meant to find solutions to identify economic problems. This solution, according to Hobson, is recommended by economic actors, manufacturers, merchants, and financiers. The politician, the statesman who commands political power, deploys it to achieve the objective. But of course, it has to give a national interest, definitely, related explanation for deployment of state power, since there are more groups in the state than merchants, manufacturers, and financiers. Now, let's take an example of what we're talking about. What would peasants, workers, and unemployed say if they knew that their government has actually committed so much of their human and material resources just in order to secure annexation of a distant territory, and this on behalf of or for the benefits of the manufacturers, merchants, and financiers only? What would they say? And this explains why politicians and statesmen do not tell the truth about why they engage in imperialist enterprise. And that's a total deception. With that, we move on to the mechanisms of Hobson's theory. Hobson also identified two mechanisms for achieving imperialist objectives. These are reversions of mercantilism and war or militarism. The choice of these mechanisms relates directly to the primary objective of imperialism in the country. This was just to annex foreign territories under various pretexts. It was the colonial stage of imperialism. Imperialist countries at this stage had to fight colonial wars because all peoples resisted colonization bid unless such resistance was broken. It was only on that basis, and it was by force of arms, colonizations could not proceed. This was to annex foreign territories under various pretexts. It was the colonial stage of imperialism. In this stage, imperialist countries at this stage had to fight colonial wars because all peoples resisted the colonization bid. Unless such resistance was broken by force of arms, colonization could actually not proceed. Again, imperialism in the 19th century had to be relevant because of the nature of economic states of affairs which gave rise to this imperialism that we're talking about. The market had to be found for dumping goods, and raw materials had to flow to the colonial metropole and to the industries. And you should bear in mind that these mechanisms later became obsolete as imperialism changed its form. Prevention of the rise of imperialism. That's the next subtopic we're treating. Hobson saw imperialism as an undesirable phenomenon. He therefore made policy recommendations to prevent the rise of imperialism. As far as he was concerned, from his own point of view, imperialism does not constitute an inevitable stage in the development. So, the following are some of the public policies recommended in order to prevent the rise of imperialism under capitalism. 1. Rapid and important structural changes in the material and social environment. 2. Public planning. And the third policy is the use of taxation to eliminate material inequalities among social classes. take note that it must be stated here that although there is recommendations conflict with the social consequences of capitalism, he upheld liberal economic traditions by totally rejecting class struggle, both between Marx labor of he upheld liberal economic traditions by rejecting both class struggle and Marx labor theory of value. For these and other reasons, Hobson's is also known as liberal theory of imperialism. Now, after treating Hobson's theory of imperialism, let's move on to Lenin's theory of imperialism. Let me introduce this to us by telling us that when Hobson's book titled Imperialism, a Study was published in 1902, it generated a lot of controversy among intellectuals in Europe and North America. The Marxists were most vocal in their criticism of his theory and its conclusions. The most outstanding of the disciples of Marx who engaged in this theoretical controversy were Lenin, Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg. Each of these Marxist theoreticians, in the process of disputations of polemics, they threw more light on the nature and essence of imperialism. Now, know that Lenin's theory was and it still remains the most popular contribution because it combines the best in the contributions of these people. Actually, so strictly speaking, Lenin's theory is not original to Lenin because various aspects of it have been articulated more or less by his fellow Marxists. For instance, the concepts of financial capital, which means the merger of industrial and bank capital, was originated by Hilferdin, who wrote a book titled Finance Capital before Lenin's book was published. V.I. Lenin, whose book bears the title Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, was published in 1916. The book was written not in Russia, as you might think, but in Zurich in the spring of that same year. It was 1916. In the preface to the Russian edition of the book, where Lenin was lamenting the paucity of literature and its subjects, he declared, and I quote, "I made use of the principal English work Imperialism, J.A. Hobson's book, with all the care that, in my own opinion, that work deserves." Now, this leaves no one in doubt that he was reacting totally to Hobson's theory. And with the above explanation, it will be highly important to take note that Lenin's theory was and it still remains the most important contribution because it combined the best in contributions of these people. So, strictly speaking, Lenin's theory is not original to Lenin because various aspects of it have been articulated more or less by his fellow Marxists. So, should we call this, in the presentation of his theory, Lenin first of all identifies features, which were 5 in number, to define imperialism. The features are as follows. 1. The concentration of production and capital developed to such a state that it creates metropolis, which plays a decisive role in economic life. 2. The second feature says that a merger of bank capital with industrial capital giving rise to financial capital and consequently to a financial oligarchy. 3. Exportation of capital as distinguished from commodity exportation. 4. The existence of international capitalist monopolies combines which divide up the world. And 5. Complete territorial division of the world among the greatest capitalist powers. Now, the synthesis of these features from the centerpiece of Lenin's theory, which he articulates, are as follows, and I quote: Imperialism is capitalist in the stage of development, in which the domination of monopolies and finance capital has established itself, in which export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which division of the world among the international trust has begun, in which partition of all territories among the great capitalist power has been completed. Now you will agree with me that this main body of Lenin's theory is purely economical in character and obviously in content, but there is also a minor historical aspect to the theory. Now, the historical portion of the theory attempts to give an explanation that imperialism is a phenomenon. It surfaces at a particular stage in the development of capitalism. Which stage are we talking about? The highest stage of capitalism. Lenin disagreed with Hobson over the possibility of rational and humane domestic, economic, and social policy curing or eliminating imperialist tendency in capitalism. Now, this is an hint that you should take note of. It has been discussed before, but you have to take note of it because of its importance. Learning obviously argues that uneven development and wretched conditions of masses are fundamental and inevitable conditions and promises of this mode of production. He further asserts that surplus capital would not be used to the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country as long as the capitalism behaves true to type. Instead, such surplus capital will be exported into the backward countries where they will attract high interest rates. Mechanisms of Lenin's theory on imperialism. The mechanisms employed by imperialism, which Lenin identified, are really similar to those of Hobson, but with some little modifications. To Lenin, militarism is a natural ally of imperialism as direct violence in forms of wars needed at various levels to achieve imperialist ends. First, military operations are necessary to subdue the indigenous peoples of the territory to be annexed, and subjugation has to be maintained by force of arms on a continuous basis. And furthermore, arms race among imperialist powers is totally inevitable because each power wants to eliminate their own in order to take over a colony or sphere of influence so that all the economic and political advantages might be accrued to her, and which could be referred to as selfishness. It states that politically, imperialism is in general a striving towards violence and reaction. On the question of catalyzation, while Hobson sees it as a means of imperialist end, Lenin views the same phenomenon as precondition for imperialism. Joseph Schumpeter's theory of imperialism. Joseph Schumpeter was an economist born in 1883. He lived and worked as a professor of economics in his native Australia before he migrated to Germany and the USA, while he died in the year 1950. Schumpeter's explanation of imperialism is sociological in nature. This explanation was articulated in his essay and I quote, "The Sociologie de Imperialisme," which was published in 1919. Through Hans Norden's translation, it became available in English language under the title Imperialism and Social Classes. Schumpeter explains imperialism as social atavism. It cannot be explained in terms of special interest, economic, political, or any other, he argues. In his view, it says imperialism is a non-rational phenomenon which consists in aggressive expansionism without a specific objective in mind. It is drawn up by impulses which characterize the aggressive behavior of individuals and social classes whenever they are under pressure. Imperialism is therefore the manifestation of the vestiges of the psychological structural outcome of such pressure and effort to survive after the pressure has gone. Nevertheless, it argues further that from being the cause of imperialism, capitalism is antithetical to it. This is because the large capacity for innovation and intervention which capitalism calls for demands in turn rationality at every turn. Therefore, it is unlikely that capitalism will predispose people to risk involved in imperialist enterprise. In his words, which I quote, it says, "Imperialism is atavistic in character. It falls into large groups of surviving features from earlier ages that play such an important part in every concrete situation. In other words, it is an element that stems from the living conditions not of present but of the past, since the vital needs that created it have passed away for good. It too must gradually disappear." Quite a number of writers have criticized Schumpeter's theory for imperialism. Some have suggested that his is not the theory of imperialism. Let's examine some of these things which Claude Ake has to say about Schumpeter's theory of imperialism. Ake's first quarrel with the theory is its definition of imperialism, which was that imperialism defined as expansionism pursued specifically by military force. It finds grossly inadequate. That's talking about the definition, and this is because military subjugation of foreign lands is not the only method for subjugation possible. In fact, the same results have been accomplished through economic means. Then Ake argues that the notion of imperialism as a purposeless impulse without the realization of a concrete objective in mind, in spite of his aggression and risk recognized, Schumpeter himself cannot be taken too seriously. Furthermore, to trace such an irritational behavior to some historical acquired disposition is, to say at least, a source of confusion. Finally, on that aspect, critically examine Schumpeter's dissociation of imperialism from capitalism on the score that capitalism is rational while imperialism is irrational, and conducts that one of the interesting things about capitalism is that it looks so rational from the perspective of the whole system. And now the multiplicity of the centers of economic decision-making, necessarily a feature of capitalism, leads totally to a waste of resources. And not only waste of resources, but competition and anarchy, and the gearing of production to effective demand means that production is often dissociated from wants. Now you will observe from the foregoing that the central message in Schumpeter's theory is nebulous and of low utilitarian value, especially when compared with the theories that we examined before. But Shamter's is not the only theory of imperialism that lacks elegance. Shortly, we shall examine another one with identical features. The next one is the devil's theory of imperialism. Unlike the theories that we have discussed so far, the devil's theory of imperialism is no handiwork of a single person or a perfection of a theory propounded by a school or thought. Thus, compared with Lenin's and Hobson's theory of imperialism, is a theory which is a rather facile statement. It was propounded by a year committee of the U.S. Senate, which investigated between 1934 and 1936 the influence of financial and industrial interests on the U.S. intervention in the First World War. This theory is sometimes referred to as the devil's theory of war. This theory, which in effect was the report of that committee, identifies a class of people that benefit from the war directly. These are ammunition makers and financial barons, as well as international bankers in Wall Street. The theory then proceeds to draw the conclusion that these categories of people, since the profit by warmongering, exert pressure on governments to wage war and engage in the expansionist and predatory policies. And in this way, the devil's theory attempts to explain imperialism as a conspiracy of capitalist class. Emphasizing the military aspects of imperialism like Schumpeter, in certain circles today, the United States' global engagement and involvement in declared and undeclared wars in different parts of the Third World are still explained in terms of influence of a military-industrial complex on American foreign policy. The general theory that can be teased out of foregoing is that imperialism as a phenomenon appears under capitalism, with industrialists and financiers performing vanguard roles in its enterprise. War is identified as the mechanism for achieving imperialist goals. As we said at the beginning of this study session, both Schumpeter's as well as the devil's theories of imperialism lack sophistication of Hobson's and Lenin's theory. The general theory that can be teased out of the foregoing is that imperialism as a phenomenon appears under capitalism, with industrialists and financiers. You must also have observed that both overly emphasize the use of military power to achieve imperialist objectives. The problem with this aspect of theory is not that they identify militarism as a mechanism. After all, both Hobson and Lenin in various ways also identify this mechanism, but they do not overemphasize it in order to avoid the impression that this is the only mechanism applicable. Discussion activity. What are the weaknesses and the theories advanced in support of imperialism? Now, so far in this study session, we were able to focus on 4 theories of imperialism. Hobson's theory of imperialism, which attributed to the rise of imperialism to maladjustments in the capitalist mode of production. Lenin identified imperialism as essentially an economic phenomenon with socio-political outgrowths. Schumpeter's theory of imperialism represents a psychological explanation for the phenomenon. The devil's theory, which was propounded by a committee of U.S. Senate, was also discussed.